Welcome, G3, to our next book study, Church Membership. We just finished up Who is Jesus? I hope that was helpful for you. Now we're jumping into a book called Church Membership. Why in the world would we have you read a book on church membership? As you jump in, I think you'll see that it's very important to know what a church member is. We looked at what an elder is, but what does it mean for you sitting out there in the congregation? What does it mean for you to be a healthy church member? Why is church membership important? This book's going to get into it. Actually, we had to read this book at Southeastern in seminary, so very good little handy book. I hope you spend some time in it and just follow all the way through with it. It might get slow some. You might say, why are we doing this? But I think by the time you get to the end, you're going to see this is very important. So I'm going to hit a couple of things. Again, there's so much I want to just slow down and go through, but time is limited. The introduction, spend some time in the introduction. Actually read the introduction this week and kind of see why he's doing this. So he starts out there, he says, you don't really want to read a book about church membership. I understand. Maybe someone handed this book to you. Maybe you wondered if it would be a useful resource for others. But honestly, the topic of church membership does not seem terribly interesting. You become a Christian and you join a church, that's about it, right? He says sometimes church membership involves programmatic elements such as classes and an interview, and the topics get entangled with questions about the Lord's Supper and baptism. But beyond all this, is there much to discuss? I think you're going to see as we go that there is much to discuss. Page 18 at the bottom there. The primary purpose is to show, for writing this book, the primary purpose is to show you what church membership is. Because it is not what you think it is. I'm not going to defend it, not directly anyhow. I'm going to present a vision for it. And here's my prediction. If you grab hold of how the Bible views church membership, it just might change the shape of your Christianity. It's a big statement. If you view what church membership is, he says it might change your shape of your Christianity. He says membership is in the Bible is an outstanding reality. Aren't you just a little curious? You're not even wholly convinced yet. It's there, are you? And so, very cool little book that I think is going to be helpful for you. Chapter 1, he starts out with this word, imperium. He says, of this word, it's what you get when you turn imperial, a word that you just might hear in coffee time conversations, into a noun. Imperium means supreme power or absolute dominion, and it gets at the idea of where the buck stops in society. As we're going to see here, Jesus has imperium, and so he established his church, and that's what he's building off of. But this chapter, we've been approaching it all wrong. Chapter 1 is where he starts out. But remember this word, imperium. It's where the buck stops in society. And then on page 20, that heading there, Jesus has imperium. 21 there, he starts getting into it a little bit more at the top there. He says, at the same time, there is one thing that should be utterly clear in a Christian's mind. The local church does not exist by permission of the state. It exists by the express authorization of Jesus. After all, Jesus has imperium, not the state. To be a Christian is to know this: Jesus is where the buck ultimately stops. Jesus is the authority to which all other authorities must answer. Jesus will judge the nations and their governments. He is the one with final power over life and death. The state exists by Jesus' permission, not the other way around. States typically don't acknowledge this fact, of course, but churches know it's true. And he says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to Jesus, and he gave the church the authority to march on the nations. His church will therefore advance like an army that cannot be stopped. The boundary lines of the nations won't stop it. The executive orders of presidents and prime ministers won't stop it. Not even the gates of hell itself will slow it down. Jesus has imperium. And so the church is so important to Jesus. He came and paid a ransom for the bride of Christ, the church, and he's the one that established the church, not the state. No matter what the state says, Jesus has authority and he established it, and the church is going to expand. And borders, nations, it don't matter. The church is still expanding. Even the gates of hell can't slow it down, he says. At the bottom there, he gets to this little thing that we talk about as pastors and stuff, and try to reprogram our vocabulary to make it make more sense and actually be more meaningful. At the bottom of 22, he says, last kind of 2 paragraphs down there, he says, we'll start with what the local church is not. If you are a Christian, the local church is not a club. It's not a voluntary organization where membership is optional for you. It is not a friendly group of people who share an interest in religious things and so gather weekly to talk about the divine. Nor is a church a service provider where the customer has all authority. He says it's ironic that we refer to the two church services. Yes, I do it too, he says. As I already said, it's as if we are telling people to pull into the church parking lot at 11 a.m. and get themselves serviced. Tune-ups for your souls in 60 minutes. At Denver Baptist, we try to kind of reprogram it instead of calling it the church service to call it the worship gathering. And that's kind of intentional to say, you know what, let's reprogram the way we think about the Sunday morning gathering. It's a worship gathering, not a service. Not coming here just to be served and tune-ups and stuff. Although I hope you leave encouraged and edified and grounded in the Word and stuff. But we're gathering together to worship. The service isn't focused on us. The service is, the gathering, there I go. The gathering is not focused on us to be a service. The worship gathering is gathered together to worship the one who has redeemed us and saved us and created us and then to go out and tell others. And so we're trying to reprogram our mind from service to gather, and he does it here too. So let's see here, continuing on page 24 down there at the bottom, the highest kingdom authority on earth. What is the local church? I'm going to say a number of things to answer that question. Let me start here. The local church is the authority on earth that Jesus has instituted to officially affirm and give shape to my Christian life and to yours. Affirms it and gives shape to it. Page 25, down there above that, that heading of looking for the right things, he says, right above there, similarly, Jesus has instituted the local church by giving it the power of the keys. Narrowly, this means it can remove a person from membership under the authority of God's Word. By implication, that means it has the enforcement mechanism necessary to establishing the basic structures of kingdom life, such as deciding who is publicly recognized as a citizen. And so, to be a church member means you're coming under the authority of what the local church says and what it looks like to live out a Christian life and a holy life. And if there's unrepentant sin that's very public and damaging to the church and to your testimony, the local church has the keys of the kingdom, also to remove those who are not following and repenting and living in unrepentant sin. And so page 26 continues on down towards the bottom. This means that the Bible doesn't talk about church membership quite as you might want it to. It talks instead about how God's people gather together under His supreme rule. It's interested in the citizens of a kingdom, not club members. Beyond this, the Bible talks about a church's unity with a number of other metaphors, family, vine, etc. He says this brings us to the second big idea. When you open your Bible, stop looking for signs of a club with voluntary members. Look instead for a Lord and His bound together people. Look also for other forms of unity, brothers and sisters in a family, branches on a vine. He says, is church membership in the Bible? If you're looking for the right things, it's everywhere. He said, I'll try to show you in chapters 2, 3, and 4. So look for those chapters as he walks through there. Continuing down on 27, that middle paragraph-ish, he says, so I'm going to, talks about not being a club, but an embassy. He says, so I'm going to use a number of biblical metaphors for describing what life inside the local church looks like. But I want to start with one that we can build on, one that replaces the club or service provider idea. It's a metaphor of an outpost or an embassy. Where am I getting the idea of an embassy? I'm getting it from the biblical idea of Christ's kingdom. A church is not the kingdom. It's an outpost or an embassy of that kingdom. What is an embassy? It's an institution that represents one nation inside another nation. It declares its home nation and interest in the host nation, and it protects the citizens of the home nation living in the host nation. I think it's a cool little metaphor there. It's an embassy. What does an embassy do? It represents a home nation in another nation. So we are part of God's kingdom living in this world. And so the church is an embassy. It represents, it tells who its citizens are. It does all those things that an embassy would do in a way. And so it's a cool little metaphor. Page 28, halfway down, middle of the page there. A Christian citizenship, Paul tells us, is in heaven. He even calls us fellow citizens with Israel, which is interesting when you consider what citizenship meant in Israel. It says, unlike Israel, however, Christians' homeland is nowhere on planet Earth. We're strangers and aliens. Christians must look forward to their homeland. They wait for the day when the kingdom of this world has become the kingdom of our Lord and His Christ, when every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. He says down there at the bottom there, a local church is a real-life embassy set in the present that represents Christ's future kingdom and His coming universal church. Page 29, he says a church, towards the bottom there, a church member is a person who has been officially and publicly recognized as Christians before the nations, as well as someone who shares in the same authority of officially affirming and overseeing other Christians in his or her church. Running out of time, but chapter 1, get to understand the metaphors that's using there, the idea of not of a club, not of a service, but of a gathering of a people, brothers and sisters, the vine and the branches, all those things. And then we're going to build off that as we continue on throughout this book. Chapter 1, jump in, spend some time there. Luke chapter 9, let's continue on real fast as we're jumping in. Luke chapter 9, as always, full of stuff. Let's look there at 9, 1 down through 6. Jesus sends out the 12 with power. And so they go out to minister and to practice what they've been seeing Jesus do. Verse 7, now Herod the Tetrarch heard about all that was happening and was perplexed because it was said by some that John had been raised from the dead. Speaking of Jesus, some said John was raised from the dead. Verse 8, by some that Elijah had appeared, and by others that one of the prophets of old had risen. Herod said, John I beheaded, but who is this about whom I hear such things? And he sought to see him. John I beheaded, who is this Jesus? Verse 18, now it happened that as he was praying alone, the disciples were with him, and he asked them, who do the crowd say that I am? And they answered, some John the Baptist, others Elijah, and others that one of the prophets of old has risen. The same thing we read about with Herod. Then he said to them, but who do you say that I am? Peter answered him, the Christos of God. He is the Christ, the anointed, the Messiah of God. Herod is asking, who is this Jesus? Jesus asked his disciples, who do the crowd say that I am? We just got finished with the book, Who is Jesus? This idea, who is Jesus, has followed us throughout Luke's gospel. Let me give you a couple. I've mentioned them before, but Luke 4:22. Luke 4:22. And all spoke well of him and marveled at the gracious words that were coming from his mouth. And they said, is this not Joseph's son? I mean, who is this? Is it? We think this is, who is this? This is Joseph's son, right? 5:21. 5:21. And the scribes and Pharisees began to question, who is this who speaks blasphemies? Who can forgive sins but God alone? Forgive sins but God alone. 7:19. 7:19 says, calling to the disciples to him, he sent them to them, saying, Lord, are you the one who's to come, or should we wait for another one? John the Baptist, are you the one? Who are you? Are you the one to come? Should we wait for another one? 7:49, same thing we see here. Then those who were at the table with him began to say among themselves, who is this who even forgives sins? Who is this who forgives sins? After the calm of the storm, the disciples marveled, and they said, who then is this, in Luke 8:25, who then is this that even commands the wind, and even the winds obey him? Who is this that commands and they obey him? Herod is saying, who is this Jesus? Jesus says, who do the people say that I am? Peter says, you are the Christ of God. You're the Messiah of God. So very cool, interesting stuff going on there. Who is this Jesus? Well, he's the one who feeds the 5,000 here in Luke too. So Luke chapter 9, verses 10 down through 17. He's the one who feeds the 5,000. You're going to see, if you're reading your whole Bible as a kind of biblical theology meta-narrative, you're going to see that there's some definitely connections with Moses and Elijah here. And they break up the 50, groups of 50. They put them in the groups there. You see this in Exodus and Deuteronomy. You also see Elijah doing it in 1 Kings 18:13. And then you have this miraculous feeding of the 5,000. If you look in John's gospel, it's connected in John 6. Jesus feeds the 5,000. This miraculous feeding, kind of like the wilderness with the manna and Moses. But Jesus says that I'm the bread of life. He connects himself with the one who came down as the bread of life. And so cool, read John chapter 6 and kind of connect those together. It's really, really interesting how what's going on there. But then Jesus tells us his purpose for coming in Luke 9:21 and 22. He strictly charged and commanded them, Luke 9:21, to tell this to no one, saying, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed and on the third day raised again. The Son of Man, we see this wonderful picture of the Son of Man that we talked about previously in Daniel chapter 7. But this Son of Man is the one who has, as Daniel says, dominion and glory and kingdoms, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. This one must be rejected. So this glorious picture of the Son of Man from Daniel 7 is connected with this suffering servant of Isaiah 53. This one who must be rejected of Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53:3, he was despised and rejected by men. He's a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted, but he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities, and upon him was a chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we were healed. These two verses are so full of descriptions that we got to see. Son of Man, glorious, reigning, ruling, connected with the suffering servant of Isaiah 53, which then says that Jesus jumps in verse 23 of what it looks like to be the disciple of this one. Just as the Son of Man must be rejected and put to death, so, Jesus says in 9:23, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. The walk of a Christian is daily denying yourself, daily picking up your cross and following him. To die to self. Disciples of this King must likewise deny themselves, and this is a daily task. Following Jesus is denying self. It's putting to death our sinful lives, and it's living for him daily, every day, following this King. But we also know that we must, as disciples, lay down our cross, but it's through the cross of Christ that we're saved. We're not saved by taking up our cross daily and laying down our lives. We're not saved by that. We're saved because Jesus took the cross for us. And because he did that, we must live lives that are set apart that looks like that. Our home lives, every bit of our daily lives is a coming and dying to ourselves and living for Jesus, which is best to do. So as I've been going through Luke, I've been using several different commentaries each week. I will say Mike McKinley just has tons. It's small, but it's got such good little nuggets that I've really enjoyed reading as I've walked through there. I think some of the G3s might have read this, but as we jump into the transfiguration here, run out of time, but now we come to this the Mount of Transfiguration in verses 28 down through 36. In this, we see that verse 28. Now, 8 days after these sayings, he took with him Peter and John and James and went to the mount to pray. And as he was praying, the appearance of his face was altered, and his clothing became dazzling white. And behold, two men were talking with him, Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his departure, which he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. So he's there on the mountain. Peter, James, and John are there. He's transformed before them, and they're speaking of his departure, which is also the Greek word for exodus. And so let's just think back. They're speaking of his exodus that's about to take place in Jerusalem. Think about what all the exodus meant for the people of Israel, taken out of slavery. They had to have one come down there to bring them out of slavery, of captivity. The Passover lamb that we talk about that spared the firstborn, all that took place there. We're here the Messiah is coming, and they're speaking of this new Exodus who comes and takes his people out of sin and establishes the church and all that's going on. We're in captivity to our sin. Jesus is coming, and they're speaking of this departure, this Exodus. Mike McKinley says this, as I'll close out: it's hard to imagine that the Jesus that we see here is the same. So this one we see here transfigured in his glory. He said it's hard to imagine that this Jesus we see here is the same Jesus that suffered and died for us. That the transfigured Jesus on the mountain is the same as the disfigured Jesus on the cross. Here on the Mount of Transfiguration, Jesus' clothes are bright like a flash of lightning. Luke 9:29. At the crucifixion, Jesus' clothes would be soaked in blood and divided among wicked men. 23:34. On this mountain, Jesus was surrounded by Moses and Elijah. 9:30. There he would hang between two criminals. 23:33. Here he is enveloped in the cloud of God's presence. 9:34. There he would hang on the cross in utter darkness. 23:44. Here he hears the voice of his Father expressing his delight in him. 9:35. There Jesus would be forsaken by the Father for us. Matthew 27:46. There's so much more on to get to this week, but spend some time in your groups. Feel free to reach out to me any questions that you might have. So much in this chapter of Luke chapter 9 and chapter 1 here as well. But God bless you. We'll see you next week.